You know, it's hard enough to lead worship when you have someone singing the wrong voice over your shoulders. We are so grateful to have Natalia helping us to enter the presence of God in worship. And the goodness of God challenges us at the very point that this morning's text challenges us. So does the last song that Natalia sang for us, Ancient of Days. The parables that we see in chapter 25 are often described as parables of the kingdom, just like the parables of chapter 13. They are stories that Jesus tells to illustrate important aspects of the kingdom of heaven. And this morning's parable challenges us with a simple question. We'll put it in the terms of the song Natalia sang for us. Does the fact that God is the Ancient of Days comfort us or frighten us? How do we relate to this triune God that we worship? It is not an unimportant question. In fact, the parable that Natalia read for us this morning suggests that it has everything to do with whether we will live the Christian life successfully or not. So let's make sure that we kind of understand what's happening with this story. Let's kind of walk our way through it briefly. This would not have been a surprising story to Jesus' disciples. Remember, He's got them all gathered around Him up on the Mount of Olives, and they're talking through some stuff. And they would not have been surprised by this story, because they knew what servants were like, what slaves were like, and they knew what landowning, wealthy people were like. Okay? But Jesus uses what would have been something of a familiar story to illustrate much deeper principles of kingdom life. So this master is going away on a journey, and he does what a lot of masters in that period of time would have done. He gathers around him his slaves, and he says, okay, I'm going to be gone for a while. I need you to manage my money. Now, sometimes slaves even did that when their masters were present. But certainly while the master is gone, the slave or slaves are entrusted with the master's resources. Now, what's really interesting here, and I think this is worth noticing, is that the master never explicitly commands them, hey, I'm giving you this amount of money. I expect you to grow it by the time I get back. He kind of leaves that up to their initiative, but the command is implicit. I think that's going to be actually really important to understand as we look at how the third servant reacts to this grant of responsibility that he is given by his master. So you've got these servants who've been given, now the NIV translates it bags of gold. The New Living Translation translates it bags of silver. More traditional translations render it talents. Now, the reason these modern translations don't render it that way is that it confuses people, because a talent in our language means something very specific. But in their language, it was both a measure of weight and a measure of currency. And what both the New International Version and the New Living Translation are trying to do is help you understand, look, this is a lot of money. Even the one servant, the third servant who gets one bag of gold, the NIV calls it, 1 talent, that is equivalent to 6,000 denarii, or approximately 20 years of a laborer's wages. Okay? So, this is a significant amount of money that they are being given charge of. And what Jesus wants us to see is this contrast between how the first 2 slaves respond and how the third slave responds. And that's really where we want to park this morning. So, you have a positive example, or actually 2 positive examples. People who are faithful to the master. Now, remember, this is a parable. So Jesus wants you to lean into the story and to see yourself within it, to try on different roles within the story and to see how they fit your own life and how the kingdom is or isn't coming to fruition in your life. Okay? Now, the master is Christ, right? Okay? Now, you could put God the Father in that place. You could even put the Holy Spirit there for that matter. But the master, for Jesus' purposes of telling this story, the master is Christ. But I have really found it also productive to ask myself these same questions with respect to God the Father. So, these first 2 servants, these first 2 slaves, are faithful to their master. Jesus emphasizes that over and over again. Notice how the master lauds those servants. Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things, right? He's emphasizing over and over again this notion of faithfulness. But what does that mean? What does that look like? How does it work itself out in the lives of these servants? We have to read between the lines a little bit, but there's some really interesting stuff there when you do. And the first thing that we recognize is that these first 2 servants live honestly before their master. Remember what we said about faithfulness in the Old Testament. There is a part of it, yes, that has to do with keeping your promises. There is a part of it that has to do with loving devotion. But there's also a part of it that has to do with just being honest. Just being trustworthy. Just telling the truth. Now we'll come back to how we know that these guys are just being honest with their master in a moment, because I think the contrast with the third slave is what really brings that to light. Right now, I just want to put that seed in your head. These guys, the master says, here's your gold, I want you to, or here's your silver, or here's your money, however he did it, here it is, go do something with it. And they do it. There's a straight line between the conversation that they have with their master and their actions. Okay? Now, the second thing that they do is they recognize the limits of their own agency. The master is the master. I'm a slave. I do what he says. He told me to take care of this money. I need to go take care of this money. Now, I want to stop here for just a second and remind us, this is a parable. So we are supposed to be we're supposed to be, I should say, finding ourselves within this parable. Faithful people are honest with Jesus. And I would tell you, not just honest in terms of, he said, go do this, I'm going to go do it, and I'm not going to make any excuses, and I'm not going to hide from him what I'm up to. But I think they're honest in the fact that they just, when they have issues, when they have struggles, when they have pain, when they have doubts, they just tell the master honestly. Moreover, part of what we do is that we recognize when we are faithful, when we're being faithful to God, to Christ, to the Spirit, we recognize I'm just a servant. Christ is my master. I remember, and you've probably heard this saying before, but I remember I was lecturing for my dissertation supervisor one day in her basic New Testament class, and I was lecturing over Revelation. And afterwards, she and I sat down and she gave me some feedback. But after we had talked about it, she said, Wade, I don't know what your view on this is. And I said, well, that was intentional because I want students to form their own opinion. She's like, yeah, but where do you stand? And I kind of explained to her what I thought was the best perspective, but I finished by saying, in my tradition, she was Roman Catholic, I said, in my tradition we have a saying, I'm not in management, I'm in sales. I don't decide how things unfold, or for that matter, who gets in and who doesn't, or anything like that. My job is to simply proclaim the message, right? Part of being faithful is recognizing the limits that God has put on us. And let me tell you, sometimes those limits can be frustrating. I was just dealing with a situation like that yesterday. It can feel like God has put us on the bench, that God doesn't love us because He won't give us more responsibility than He has. But our job is simply to remember the limits that have been placed upon us. I am a servant. I'm not the master. Now, but the most important trait that these first two disciples have, these first two servants, I should say, have, is that they have lost themselves in service to the master. They have lost themselves in devotion to the master. Remember, sometimes we render that Hebrew word chesed as faithfulness. It certainly has an element of faithfulness to its meaning. But it's a word more of devotion. And when Jesus uses these, or at least when Matthew's translating and he's using these Greek words, he has these different Hebrew ideas in mind from the Old Testament. We'll come back to that in a little while. Okay? These servants lose themselves in devotion to the master. Could they have had the same fears as the third servant? Possibly. But they're not worried about that. They are acting not out of concern for their own welfare, but out of concern for the master's welfare. What is it that's going to benefit the master? What is it that's going to honor him? What is it that's going to glorify him? What is it that's going to promote his interests? Nelda will probably remember this because she's read this book too, but in Peter Gregg's book, God on Mute, there's this excruciatingly painful story of this Christian pastor and missionary and theologian whose daughter was quite literally in danger of death. And one of the most excruciating things that he ever had to do was to pray Of course, yes, he's praying for her. He's praying for her healing. He's praying for her survival. But he's also praying, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. He is praying even beyond that. Lord, I want you to do what will glorify you best. That is a hard thing to pray, especially when the very life of someone we love is at stake. And I'm not saying we have to always pray that way, but it is an illustration of the kind of radical self-abandonment that is being modeled here. And of course, because these servants lose themselves in devotion to their master, because their first thought is about his well-being, not their own, they make the most of what he gives them, each according to their ability. Now, let's contrast that with the negative example that Jesus gives us. What's going on with this fellow? What's going on with this third fellow? Well, he relates to his master out of fear. He relates to his master out of fear. Now, we'll come back to how much of that is the case in a little bit. But he relates to his master on the basis of fear, at least on the surface. That's his excuse for the way that he behaves. And what is it that he does? Well, he throws the first two servants' behavior into much starker relief by the way that he behaves. When the master is having this conversation with his servants about, okay, here's your five talents, here's your 2 talents, here's your 1 talent, he doesn't say to the master, hey, look, I'd really rather just not have this responsibility, because if I lose it all, you're going to chop off my head. And to be honest, I'd rather somebody else did this. That would have been the honorable thing to do. It might not have kept him alive, but at least it would have been honorable. No, instead, and by the way, he doesn't even talk to his fellow servants and go, hey, what are you guys going to do? I'm scared of this guy. What are you guys going to do? No. He goes out, he buries the guy's money in a hole in the ground. Now, when he knows, by the way, now he's going to pretend that he doesn't know, but he knows full well what is being expected of him. Now, in the process, what he does is he actually overstates the danger. And the master is the one who points it out. The master's kind of like, don't give me all of that. All you had to do was go put my money on deposit with the bankers, and I would have at least gotten something back. He's not demanding to double his money like the other guys did. He's just demanding do something with it other than burying it in the ground. Right? It wouldn't have actually been that hard just to do something. But as people who are afraid often do, this man acts irrationally. There's been a lot of talk lately in different books by different authors about what they like to call our lizard brain. That is the lowest portion of your brain at the very back, and it controls, among other things, responses to opportunities and threats. It seizes upon opportunities and it runs from threats. The problem is that doesn't work well for most things that we do as humans. And when we are being run by our lizard brain, the higher parts of our brain shut off. We're not using our logic centers in the left side of our brain. We're not using our identity centers in the right side of our brain. We're just running scared. I'll give you a perfect example, okay? And I've got this scar on my jawbone to prove that this story is true. I am deathly afraid of lightning, okay? And I was out with a friend one night when I was a teenager, and we were coming home and it had been storming severely. Now, the storms were mostly past by the time we got home, but of course it was still lightning around and that kind of thing. He pulls up at the end of my driveway. I jump out of his car, run around the end of his car, and I'm running for the door because I'm scared of lightning. Now, never mind that I have always been night blind, okay? And it's 11 o'clock at night. But I'm running down the end of this sidewalk. You can guess what happened, can't you? I hit the bush at the end of the sidewalk. It threw me off all the way down the sidewalk, and I bounced off of the pillars that held up our little front porch cover thing, you know. And I thought I wasn't hurt because I hit that thing full on right here. But I also hit it here. So I come, of course, Mom and Dad heard it. They come out there. They're already in bed. They come out there and I'm like, I'm okay. I'm okay. And my dad takes one look at me and goes, no, you're not. I mean, blood was gushing. So we had to take me back to Little Rock to the emergency room. We'd been in Little Rock. Now I had to go back to the emergency room, and we didn't wait for the plastic surgeon, so I have a scar. 2:30 in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, some on-call surgeons just, repairing my poor little jaw there. That's what we do when we are acting out of our lizard brain. That's what this guy does. He does something irrational. And here's the thing about that part of our brain. Yes, it's great at problem solving, but it only thinks about itself. So, of course, what happens with this servant? He sacrifices his master's well-being for his own. Of course, the irony is, as we'll see in just a moment, he gets neither. Because it just doesn't work that way in the kingdom. Now, have you ever been tempted to relate to God this way? Have you ever been tempted to relate to God this way? I have. It is a temptation that I struggle with every day. Just preparing this sermon has been illuminative for me. Because here's the other thing about people who act out of fear. They don't realize they're doing it a lot of times. Sometimes they do. But a lot of times, particularly in social situations, they don't realize that's what they're doing. And there are lots of people acting out of fear towards God who don't realize that's what they're doing. Their whole prayer life is saturated with fear and with selfishness. Because everything in their prayer life is really about just staving off eternal destruction. It's not about drawing near to God. It's about getting what they want for themselves. It's not about building a relationship with their Creator. This parable is so wonderful. It's so amazing because it illustrates everything that Jesus has been teaching throughout Matthew's Gospel. Now, if we're going to drive the point home, let's compare and contrast the results. Okay? The results of a life shaped by faithfulness or a life controlled by fear. Notice the change in language there. Now, take you back to high school English class. What's the difference between a comparison and a contrast? A comparison puts two things side by side that are pretty similar. A contrast puts two things side by side that are different, right? Well, we've got a little bit of comparison because in both cases, the true character of the servant is revealed. And the master points it out to each one of them. But that's where the comparisons end. It's all contrast after that, right? Because what do we learn about these first servants? They are good and faithful. Now, when New Testament scholar N.T. Wright translates this text, he kind of, tries to sort of de-theologize these words and say, oh, well, it's well done, excellent, and loyal servant. No, I actually don't think that's, you could translate it that way, but I actually don't think that's what's going on here. I think Jesus is intentionally echoing these Old Testament concepts of goodness and faithfulness. And what is it that we've been saying basically ever since I've been here? God is nothing if not good and faithful. So what's going on with these servants? Their character reflects the character of their master, right? So see, when we lose ourselves in devotion to Jesus, it's because He's already lost Himself in devotion to us. That's a really significant part of the cross. It doesn't just illustrate God's love for us, it demonstrates that love. While we were still sinners, while we were still God's enemies, Christ died for us. He lost Himself. He lost everything in devotion to us. And He still loves us that way. Remember what Paul prayed for the Ephesians. He's told them in Ephesians chapter 3, my prayer for you is that you will know how long and high and wide and deep is the love of Christ. These servants are learning how to be human from their master. They're doing what He did. Now, it's because of their disposition more than their skill. Now, their skill is important. Remember what Jesus said at the beginning. Each one was given different amounts of money based on their aptitude, right? So Jesus, the master, is not asking of you things you can't do. Okay? But the most important factor is their character. It is their disposition. It's who they are. And so because of that, the master praises these servants. More than that, he gives them additional responsibilities and he invites them to join in his joy. To participate in his joy. That's the word there. The NIV's translation is a little soft. It's not just his happiness, it is his joy. And in fact, I love what I really like how the New Living Translation takes this whole parable. But I especially like what they do with this. Let's celebrate together. That's how they kind of paraphrase that, come and share your master's joy. They say, come, let's celebrate together. That really hits the heart of what the master is saying to these servants. It's a remarkable invitation. And remember what psychologist and theologian Jim Wilder has taught us. Joy is something that is by definition relational, both biblically and psychologically. We were just talking about this on the way to church this morning. When you are happy to see someone, all of a sudden they see that joy in your eyes and it creates joy in their eyes. It activates their mirror neurons. But here's the thing, it also amplifies that joy. So now all of a sudden, what you see in their eyes is even more intense than what you were communicating. And then that affects you in the same way. And you have this whole joy amplification process. So many of us, as we think about the future, as we think about what God wants to do in our lives, both in this age and in the age to come, we think about the stuff that means things to us. We think about food, and not just because we're smelling it. We think about loved ones that we've lost. We think about beauty. And all of those things are part of the eschatological vision. We think about all the pain and sorrow that will be gone. That's part of it too. But the greatest aspect, the thing that makes it all work, the thing that makes it all go, is the presence of God and the realization of how much God loves us. And the joy that builds in our own hearts and overflows in love for Him and love for one another. It is a radically different vision of human existence than what we see in our world, where hatred begets violence, and violence begets more hatred. And it is a never-ending downward spiral. And so much of that is rooted in fear. By the way, and not unjustified fear often, but fear all the same. Now let's contrast this with this other servant, the one whose life is controlled by fear, whose life is controlled by his most basic instincts. How does Jesus describe this servant? You wicked, lazy servant. His own character is brought out into the light, isn't it? And not only is his character exposed, but so is his disposition towards his master. Nah, I knew you were a good-for-nothing spendthrift who fleeces everybody you can get your hands on. So I just buried your money in the ground. Here's what's yours. There is a genuine disdain that this man has for his master. And you almost get the idea from the way that Jesus tells the story that the master doesn't really believe he's afraid of him after all. We're kind of left in a little bit of uncertainty. Was this guy really acting out of fear, or was he just acting out of selfishness? I think that ambiguity is actually really good for us, because sometimes it is really difficult for us to tease out our own motivations. Just because we're afraid doesn't justify our actions, but sometimes we're just using fear as a cover for darker motivations. So the servant is condemned. That's not surprising. But what is surprising is that even that which he had been entrusted with is taken away from him and given to someone else. It is absolutely vital for us to remember that we can't just sit and hold the deposit of faith that's been given to us. That's the problem, frankly, with people who walk down the aisle, profess faith in Christ, get dunked in the baptistry, and basically never do anything with it. I would argue that at least in Matthew's presentation, that's not salvation. And what's really interesting about this parable is that this parable shows us that time reveals all. Remember the parable of the wheat and the weeds back in Matthew 13? Remember what's happening there? You have this field and you've got wheat planted in it, but then some weeds get into it too because an enemy did it. And the servants say to the master, hey, do you want us to go weed that field so that the weeds aren't messing with your wheat? What does the master say? No, because while you're trying to dig up the weeds, you might dig up the wheat too. Just let them grow together, and at the time of the harvest, it'll be clear who are the weeds and who are the wheat. This is the same principle. Remember, the master went on a long journey, right? And it is over time that our discipleship is revealed. It is over time that our discipleship, the genuineness of that discipleship, or as Dietrich Bonhoeffer would put it, the genuineness of our faith is revealed. And so what this guy had, his deposit of whatever it was, however we should interpret this money and what role it plays in our lives, whatever spiritually it symbolizes, that is taken from him and it's given to the guy who already has 10 talents, who's already got this huge amount of money to be responsible for. The good servants are given more responsibility. The bad one loses everything that he has. And then notice what happens. And again, this is one of those places where I really like what the New Living Translation does. This guy is tied up, thrown outside into the dark. And now he knows what fear and grief really are. He lived a life controlled by fear. Now his destiny is controlled by fear and grief too. That's the point of this weeping and gnashing of teeth, or as one translation put it, weeping and grinding of teeth. It's a horrible fate. Now, there is so much that we could talk about in closing, but I just want us to keep our eyes on this central question. Because all of us, to be honest, are a mix of faithfulness and fear, right? We're all a mix of faithfulness and fear. But here's the question, right? Here's the question. It's one thing to be afraid of the master's disapproval. That's actually a good thing. To live in reverent awe towards God is a good thing. But that's not the same thing as living life afraid of the master. Living life afraid of God, afraid of Christ. Our job is not to live afraid. It is to live a life of faith. Faith that is rooted in love and that works itself out in faithfulness. Like we said, that's what Jesus has been telling us all along. Remember? Matthew chapter 16. If you try to hold on to, if you try to preserve your life, the word there is actually sozo, save. If you try to save your life, if you try to make sure that you are taken care of, that you're okay, you're going to lose everything. But if you lose your life in devotion to Jesus, then all of a sudden you find it. Or Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. What's the greatest commandment? Well, obviously, love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. This absolutely vital text from Deuteronomy 6, 5 through 6. And love your neighbor as yourself. Again, losing yourself in devotion to God and in devotion to others. That's a very different thing than living in constant fear, wondering, is God out to get me? Is God going to destroy me? My invitation to you this morning is to choose faithfulness over fear. Now look, I get it. It may take some time. It probably will take some work. That's okay. That's okay. Jesus perpetually, again and again, in this gospel, puts an impossible standard in front of us. And He never compromises the standard. And yet, He gives us grace over and over and over and over and over again until the very last verse. That's what's so beautiful about this gospel. Trust yourself to that process rather than to the process of self-preservation, rooted in fear and selfishness. Let us pray.